Hello, Lianne. How are
Hi,
you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Thank you for agreeing to be a guest on From SME to You, my little podcast. I am delighted that you're here because you are the owner of a very important type of business and one that we normally do not hear much about from that point of view. You are an early years business called Bonitots in the Southeast London area. So tell me a bit about Bonitots, who you are, how did you come to be, and your journey to founding Bonitots and being your own boss.
Okay, so I have an older daughter. I've got three children. One of them is 20, and I had her when I was really young, and I was studying Spanish at university, and she came with me on my year abroad and just learned Spanish just through, being three and absorbing it. And it was super frustrating for me that I by the time we went over to Spain to live in Spain, I had been studying at university for 2 years already, and I was still getting my head around the subjunctive. It was still a challenge, and within weeks of us being there, Ella was just using it fluently, and I was like, this is it just really not fair, but also incredible. So that was kind of my introduction to I suppose how brilliant children are with second languages. And I started doing some research and discovered that there were these huge benefits, and I was just really pleased that she had that that opportunity, I suppose, and the gift of being able to speak a second language. So fast forward, I think it was 12 years later, I had my second child, and I decided I didn't want to work in the city anymore, and I wanted to open a bilingual nursery. I wanted to open a Spanish immersion nursery in London. I knew from my research that the only way to really achieve bilingualism in children is through some sort of immersion, whether that's through immersion in the home or immersion in an outside setting. But you can't really achieve it through kind of teaching them for a few hours a week. So I was really determined that my next child would have the same opportunity. And I mean, I'd actually been thinking about it for a long time, and I decided to start as a childminder setting so that we could sort of build up in a manageable way. There was no kind of minimal risk in terms of financial outlay and stuff like that, and so that I could kind of also get a sense for what the demand was like, and see whether there was any kind of scope to grow beyond that. So I started off just me and working with one assistant, so we could look after 6 children at a time. And then we got a long waiting list. I took on another assistant, so we could have 9 children at a time. And that's the limit when you're a childminder. You can't have more than 2 assistants, or you become, a nursery.
Yeah.
And then a nursery just happened to come up for lease at the bottom of the road. And I was like, well, we've got a good, strong waiting list. I can get some investment because I've got evidence of the amount of people that would like to come to the nursery, and this is the opportunity. So I went for it, and that's when Bonitots, sorry, that's really annoying, there's a sound there. That's when Bonitots became what it is now, I suppose. So we opened the nursery, and we've just grown ever since.
Fantastic. So in your previous life, what were you doing, and what do you think made you realize I really want to set up by myself? Was it the arrival of your second child, or were there any other factors externally that made you go, now I'm going to be out for myself?
Yeah, I mean, so I was working in the city. I was a company director of a really brilliant organization which works with young people from various diverse backgrounds, whether that's race, gender, sort of social mobility. And we basically supported young people to get into roles that they might not have considered, and that they might have considered as out of their reach. And we sort of bridged some gaps between, sort of education and so on, to make sure that they could then perform well at interview and would feel comfortable and so on in those environments. So I'd had this background of, I suppose, seeing how experiences in childhood can, have this real knock-on impact on what, the opportunities that are available to you as an adult. All the students that we worked with were at top universities. They were just they were sort of average of 3 A's at A level. They're really sort of high caliber students, but lots of them were kind of crippled by self-doubt and low confidence and so on. So I think, and as we kind of, as the business or the organization that I was working with then grew, we started to realize that we needed to kind of go back earlier and earlier in education to start making a difference. And the furthest we got was secondary. And so we'd start working with secondary school students and doing, various events and interventions to kind of get them the cultural capital and confidence and all the other stuff that you need to be able to compete with someone who's, maybe been to Eton and has been sitting around the table with the people that are interviewing them for their whole sort of life, as they come over for dinner or whatever. So I think that was, as I say, it was a real insight into the importance of like early experiences in kind of determining the opportunities that are available to people. And that combined with the fact that I had my second child, as I said, and I really wanted to be around for her and with her, and the fact that I wanted her to speak Spanish. And the only way for me that I could think of for me to really do that was to open a nursery, sort of moving to Spain. All of those things kind of combined. And I was just really passionate about providing that for my child, but also, providing that opportunity to other children that might not have access to speaking other languages and all the many benefits that come with that. That sort of, it came from a place of passion, really, of, wanting to do this for lots of reasons that were both personal and about kind of, I suppose, society and sort of, as I say, bridging some gaps and, giving early opportunities that could really make a tangible difference to children. And so, obviously there's a balance there, because at the same time, you have to have a business model that is sustainable. So what I would love is, to be able to just have everybody come to the nursery for free, but sadly that doesn't work. But what we have been able to do is over the summer, where we have some children on term time only, and basically there's this gap over the summer where our numbers are sometimes lower and we have some spaces. So each summer we've always been able to offer some of those spaces to children that otherwise wouldn't have access to what we do and what we offer. And that's been wonderful, because I've been able to sort of, as I say, see children who, don't have any Spanish in their home whatsoever, and they're sort of developing this skill that will have lots of benefits for them.
And so the interesting thing is not just that, is that you took the leap to opening up the business in this building that you found down the road. And this was 2019.
Yeah.
So fast forward to March 2020, and tell me a bit about what happened from your end, because I experienced the other side of things. For disclosure to anyone reading or listening, my child goes to Lianne's wonderful nursery. And so obviously when the pandemic hit, that is not just a huge impact for any business, as we saw in the global economy and the UK in particular, but when you are a new business, it's something that you couldn't have predicted and you couldn't have planned for. So how did you put some walls to contain the league, and how did you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, it was really tough. I think what compounded it is that the early years found themselves on the front line of the COVID response, because, where other people, well, you obviously had, doctors and nurses and certain professions that were kind of working with people despite this kind of order to stay away from people. But the difference with the early years, I think, is that, it wasn't necessarily what any of our staff had signed up to kind of be on the front line of this sort of global crisis, and be essentially putting themselves at risk. And at that point, obviously, there was a lot of fear. I mean, it was a terrifying time. Yeah. Lots of our staff were in the UK when their families are in Spain or, parts of Latin America. And it was really tough and really grueling psychologically for our staff. And I think the hardest thing for me was having to make decisions that would kind of get the balance somehow right between, delivering what we needed to deliver and keeping people safe. And, it really felt really tough. And literally life or death, it felt like we were making life and death decisions. And again, it just wasn't what I'd signed up for, certainly not in that sense, and there was one moment, I think the sort of darkest moment, where one of our staff members who had been working as part of the kind of, to provide care for key workers, caught COVID, and her dad caught it from her, and he went into hospital, and, it wasn't clear whether he was going to make it. And there was just this moment where I was kind of like, obviously she made a choice to be there, but ultimately the decision to stay open and keep providing care for key workers had been mine. And it just felt very big and sort of really tough. And I'm friends with lots of nursery owners, and they were sort of telling stories about staff members that had died, and it was just like it was obviously unthinkably hard that time for everyone, and for me, I think that was one of the things that made it hardest. In terms of how we navigated it, I mean, again, I don't, just by the skin of our teeth, really. It was, just being as responsive as possible, trying to think a step ahead in a situation where it was impossible to predict what was going to happen. I'm very lucky that I have a sort of somewhat of a sciencey background, and one of my key members of the team is, she has a PhD, and we were sort of able to decipher some of what was going on. And we did make decisions sometimes to ignore the government's advice where we thought it was putting people at risk. And we explained all of that to our families and kind of explained our reasoning. But again, it was kind of, I think I just felt that we needed to be able to live with the decisions that we made. So although sometimes, as I say, we were going against government advice of just, everyone just kind of relax and do whatever. And we were kind of like, we're actually not going to do that. We're going to kind of keep taking these precautions, and this is why, and this is what the research says, and this is what SAGE says. And that was very much a conscious decision to not be pressured into doing things that could result in outcomes that we would ultimately have to live with. I think the other real difficulty is that obviously we're a new business, and the financial projections were that in March 2020 we would start breaking even, and then at some point I might have been able to start paying myself, and that just didn't happen.
That's what I was going to say, because obviously there's such a clear dual aspect. The first one was psychological and physical safety for everybody. But the second is that you are still a business. So regardless of of what happens if you want to continue trading. You need the money. If people are not going to the school, the fees are not coming the same way that you were to, so your cash flow goes out the window. Tell me more what to do your couple.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the really tough things for us was the situation with furlough, because, you know, casting your mind back, with furlough, basically at the beginning, someone was either furloughed or they were working, and there was no scope for a middle ground. And what that meant was, you know, we had to have this kind of small core of staff that were there delivering care for key worker children. And in an ideal world, we would have been able to share that burden, and staff would have been able to rotate, but the furlough rules made that impossible. So that was kind of one thing that made the financial aspect really challenging. And then the other thing was, you know, obviously furlough covered staff, so, you know, 80% of staff wages, but we had lots of other overheads that didn't go away just because we were closed. Yeah. And so we had to find a way to fund those. And so we just had to be really creative, think on our feet, think about our families as well, who were in difficult situations as well. And, you know, very early on, I kind of, again, had to make a decision that, you know, if we couldn't make it work, then that was okay. You know, I wasn't going to risk people's lives or more than I felt comfortable with, because there was some risk. And I wasn't going to, you know, destroy sort of my own mental health and that of my team. You know, that those weren't costs I was willing to pay. So I basically offered, I explained the whole situation again to the families that were attending the nursery, and I explained why we were sort of, despite furlough, we still needed some income if we were going to keep going, because, you know, that's how it works. And what we agreed with families was that if they felt they could afford it, they would pay some contribution towards what would have been their fees. And then when we reopened fully, that would be, you know, the total of whatever they paid would be spread over 12 months, and we would kind of pay that back to them. So essentially it was a loan from our families. And obviously some couldn't afford it and some could. And we just sent out a questionnaire and said, you know, just be really honest, and we're going to figure out whether we can keep this going or not. And fortunately we had enough families that were able to pay some amount so that we could then just keep it ticking over until we could kind of get back on our feet. And again, it was, you know, as you will remember, it was such a fast moving situation. We had no idea how long it was going to go on. We had no idea, even at that point, we didn't know that children were sort of actually not as badly affected by COVID. You know, it was all just, you know, this sort of completely amorphous, like unknown blob of kind of what is going to happen. So we were making all of these decisions blind, you know. But again, it was just kind of look at what the situation, we had to kind of dispassionately look at what the situation was, make decisions about what we were willing and what we weren't willing to do, and then kind of invite our families that we worked with to kind of join us on the journey as much as they could commit to, and yeah, we managed to scrape through.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, that the lack of knowledge at that point, you know, which is no one's fault because it was something entirely new, makes it even harder to plan, because, you know, no matter what an unfortunate event is, some of them are rehearsed to a certain degree, right? Or can be, but this was completely unprecedented without knowing the length, the way that it could be navigated, the amount of preparation that we were going to have to do for coming back. It's very tricky. So casting my mind back, I think it was back in July that you were able to reopen again. And so that must have been, you know, a relief, breath of fresh air back into the business. What's been happening in the business since then? Because obviously the point was that at the point that you had to close, it was still very early stages since you opening it, and so you probably didn't have full classrooms. So how did you get the word out to not just say we as Bonitots are open again, but also we're open for business to more families?
I mean, we've been really lucky with that. All of our business really has come through word of mouth. We've not had to do much marketing. I mean, if any. So it's really just been a case of, you know, we have good relationships with our families, and we work really hard, and our families know that, and you know, so they tell other people, and you know, it spreads that way. So that's happened quite organically. I think the bigger challenge actually was matching the demand in terms of staff. So we, you know, the plan was always to grow slowly, so that, you know, as we took on more children, we would add staff in a manageable way, and not end up, you know, not kind of start with this massive burden of salaries that we couldn't cover and just get more and more into debt. So that was a wonderful idea. And then COVID happened, and some people didn't want to be in the UK and away from their family anymore. I mean, you know, COVID had so many impacts beyond the sort of obvious ones in terms of, you know, us all being in lockdown and whatever. There was a lot of psychological fallout. Yeah. People reevaluating what was important, and, you know, where they wanted to be and who they wanted to be with, and, you know, actually, was career the most important thing?
You had a double hit, because it wasn't just COVID. We then got into the end of free movement with Brexit, where,
I mean,
talk about
it was just, yeah, it was the Brexit was and continues to be really tough for us. So the context is that the early years already had a recruitment crisis, but long before COVID. The early years has had a recruitment crisis for many years. And we'd never had a problem, because Spain has high levels of unemployment and a really highly qualified young population. So we were kind of bucking the trend that other nurseries were having, and we were employing, you know, people with masters, but multiple masters in education, and, you know, various teaching degrees, and people that were passionate and loved what they did, so passionate they would be willing to go overseas to seek opportunities. So we were doing so well on that front, and we had this really excellent team. And then COVID hit, which did have some impact definitely on morale. And as I say, you know, people seeing other members of staff, you know, when that member of staff's dad got ill, and the impact that had on everyone, all of us, you know, kind of like, this is real now, you know. So there's lots of that stuff going on. And then suddenly, you know, Brexit hits, and we can't recruit from Spain, and you have to go through this really, really painful process to get registered as a sponsor. And then when you are, you have to pay just extortionate amounts of money to be able to hire from Spain. And so that was really, really difficult. And then add into the mix that, as I say, people were just reevaluating, you know, what's important to me. And so many of my my fellow nursery owners were telling stories of people being like, do you know what, like, I'll get paid more to work in Lidl, and it's way less stressful, so that's what I'm going to do. And I get that, you know, it's working in the early years is so rewarding and so brilliant, but even if you're just focusing on doing the best you can for the kids, it's really tough. You know, you're giving and giving and giving all day. If you want to be good at what you do, you have to be really good at just giving, and keeping that patience, just without ever losing any kind of, even the tiniest hint of frustration shouldn't see, you know. So it's very demanding physically and emotionally. But then there's also this other aspect, which is that the government has for a long time been putting more and more pressure on the early years, because I think, you know, the trend in the UK government has tended to be that if there is a problem at the end of a system, we need to do more of what we're doing sooner. So where we're not performing well in the league tables internationally at 15 and 16, that must mean that we're probably, what we're doing is right, it's just we need to be doing it sooner. So we need to be, it's not just thinking about primary education, we need to be sort of drilling these kids from, you know, nursery age. We need to be getting this stuff right really early on for it to sort of filter through. And it doesn't match what the research says. You know, the research shows that actually the systems that are doing really well are nothing like our system. So actually, you know, I feel very confident that the problem isn't in the early years. I think the problem is in our system, but that's not how the government sees it. So as a result, they put all this pressure on, and you know, Ofsted has a lot to answer for. You know, I've got so many of my fellow nursery owners who are losing staff and closing their settings because they just don't want to deal with them anymore, and it's just not worth it. So you know, so when you add all of that kind of mounting pressure, plus, as I say, the pressure of kind of having been put into this kind of dangerous situation that you didn't sign up for, is lots of people are just kind of like, this just isn't worth it. It's just not worth it. And you know, it's a really difficult sector to make the wage that you deserve in. So you don't even get remunerated. So it's kind of, yeah, that all of that combined together again into this perfect storm. And we just had this big swathe of people that for various reasons were just like, this just isn't working for me. And I was supportive of every single one of them, because I just don't think, you know, I never think that you should kind of prioritize anything above your mental health and your happiness and your right to be fairly remunerated for doing a job and, you know, recognized and all of that sort of stuff. So we then had to really put our staff wages up just to keep people, you know, aside from, we've always worked really hard to be super supportive of our team, but, you know, realistically, this is London and people need to live. They're not just going to kind of come to work just, you know, just because we're nice to them. So we then had to, put up our staff's wages, and at the same time we're repaying this loan to our parents. So we had to start putting our prices up. And I think earlier on you mentioned, you know, how do we kind of set our prices and stuff like that. And the answer is really simple. We look at what we need to spend to deliver our service, and then we match that in our income. So I mean, profit is just not something we're aiming for. We just don't work for profit. I'm really lucky as well that my husband has been able to kind of support our family financially. So you know, for a long time I didn't take any salary whatsoever, and then just recently I started taking you know, the accountant said there's this kind of minimum amount that it makes sense to take as a salary, but it's you know, it's doesn't in any way sort of recompense me or my family for kind of the time and stress and love and energy that I've put into the business. But it's a decision that, again, that I've made knowingly and you know, relatively comfortably, because I feel a real sense of duty, but also care for the community of Bonitots, our team, who are just, I mean, you know, they're incredible. Our families, the children, you know, so you know, I was privileged enough to be able to make that decision, and it's meant that, you know, as I say, we have been able to kind of keep staff. And the final thing I think is just being able to prioritize quite ruthlessly. You know, there's lots of things that I would love to do and would be really nice to do, and there's lots of messages that I would love to respond to, and, you know, all of that stuff. And sometimes, I mean, I've just had to get really, really just ruthless about that stuff. Like, I know what our priorities are, and I am always working towards those priorities, and anything that gets in the way, unfortunately, sort of gets binned.
So, Lianne, I think that what is extremely unusual about owning a nursery as a business is that, unlike most businesses, I would say, it's not something that you do with not just the view of getting rich, but like you were talking about, making a profit goes out the window. And obviously, I imagine it's also because whatever little money you're able to make, you're reinvesting back in the nursery itself to benefit ultimately the children and the staff. So how is this for you some sort of sustainable, as a business owner, way of seeing the business, and what do you think makes it worth it?
I don't think it is sustainable. Not forever. And when I say that, I mean, for me personally, it's not sustainable. But at the moment, it feels, it doesn't feel optional. It's kind of like, I suppose I could just close it and then I wouldn't have to live like that. But if I want it to stay open and I want it to be providing the standard of care that I expect and want, then that's the only way to kind of manage it at the moment.
Yeah.
That doesn't, I suppose the hope is that that wouldn't be the case forever, but looking at the sector as a whole at the moment, I think, all nurseries are struggling, potentially with the exception of the big chains, but even they're struggling. I mean, they're having to pay staff, or pay potential staff money to like attend interviews, and they're sort of poaching staff from other settings.
Oh my gosh,
yeah. I mean, it's like it's sort of the sector is in a massive crisis in terms of staff, and so wages have had to go up, which is so brilliant because staff deserve to be paid more than minimum wage. But then, it's also families can't afford to pay it really even more than they already are. And, so I think I have, again, I've learned really had to learn very quickly how to make, how and when to make decisions that are more about the business than about being nice. So, we used to do things like, we would waive some of the terms and conditions if a family was in a particular situation, and or if they were just really kind of needing something or whatever. So, for example, deposits and stuff like that. Returning them even without notice and things like that. And we, that was a reaction, I suppose, to very specific, unique situation, which was the COVID and how people were suffering. But we just can't do that. I mean, if I do, then we risk everything. So it's kind of, I've had to just take quite a utilitarian approach to all decisions. So, we've got these 4 priorities, which are happy children, happy team, happy parents, families, carers, and happy purse. Those are our 4 priorities. And the order of those priorities adjusts according to the situation. And, for me, happy team is kind of where all the others come from. So if your team's happy, they do a good job and everything else falls into place. So that's kind of how I figure out what I need to do and who I need to say no to. And I think, going back to what you were saying about early years being this quite unusual business, in that, there is this vocational caring element to it. And that does mean that sometimes families, don't treat us like a business. So, if you went to Sainsbury's to buy your shopping, you wouldn't get to the till and be like, can I just have this and like pay, I don't know, next week or, next month or just next year, or just maybe like maybe pay half, or, you know, but with nurseries, there's this kind of sense that, you know, you're caring for children. So, you know, it's not really a business, is it? It's about being nice. And there definitely is an element of that, but you can't survive if you...
No. Being nice doesn't bring the money that you need to survive. Yeah, that's very interesting, because like you say, it puts you in a completely different dynamic of customer service. You know, you have very clear terms and conditions, but you're dealing with small people. So there's a lot more emotional involvement there, not just by the small people.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, you know, the thing is you develop relationships with families. So there is a difference than, you know, if you're a mortgage company, for example, and someone doesn't pay their mortgage, you take the house back. If you're looking after a child and you love the child and you care about the child and they're important to you, and the family says at the moment we just can't afford this, then it is very hard to kind of just be really brutal about it. So we do have a human element to us, and we will maintain that. But it's just, you know, making sure that we are making the decisions that we have to make when we have to make them, because my team also, I really care about my team, and I need to be able to pay their wages.
Yeah, exactly. And that, I would love to know more about how you set up your pricing and your decisions, because obviously there are nurseries that charge less, or nurseries that charge a lot more. The difference is that in the UK, the early years is hardly subsidized by the government. So the majority of that payment is directly coming from the families. But again, there's a huge discrepancy from when I did my research early on about going here or going there. How did you work out your pricing?
I mean, it literally, it was just looking at our costs and figuring out what we need to meet them. So, you know, I mean, obviously it's more complex than that. You've got your fixed overhead, and then in nurseries there's these variables that are kind of it's different to other businesses, but essentially children of different ages will bring in X amount of revenue depending on the number of children that you need, the number of staff you need for a group of children. That's a really complicated and confusing thing I've just said, but yeah, basically we just meet our costs and that's it. But obviously costs go up. You know, we've got a cost of living crisis at the moment. Our staff needs more money. Our suppliers are all coming to us saying this is going up and that's going up. So, you know, we have to look at that. And it's always really tough. And that, you know, again, it's something that comes up in one of my Facebook groups of nursery owners. It's one of the hardest things, putting prices up. And I think because it does feel so expensive to families. I mean, it is expensive, you know. There's no getting around it. It's really expensive. So we're always just very conscious of kind of making sure that we are, you know, spending money where we need to deliver the service that we want to deliver. And the most important part of that is our team. So it just, you know, the vast majority of our income goes on our team. And then looking at, you know, what do we have to have? What would be nice to have? And, you know, it's just the same decisions that other businesses are making. But I think, as you say, it's one of the rare businesses where you are getting probably a large chunk of a family's income is going to you. And you're looking after the most precious thing in their world. The fact
that most of us go like, well, you know, the nursery cost for a child that is 5 times a week for a month is equivalent to a mortgage in London. Is significant, and it's not that you're not glad paying it for the quality that is delivered. It's that you just don't have it lying around.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. And it's kind of like, Yeah, one of the things, to go back to what you said about the early years not being funded by the government, it's actually worse than that, because the UK government, it's a bit political now, but the UK government basically promises families something that they don't deliver, which is free childcare. They say that, when your child is 3, you will get 30 hours of free childcare, which then, parents discover that actually that means it's a lot less than that when you spread it out over the whole year, because that's term time only. But actually what the government does is they set an arbitrary amount for how much they're going to pay to nurseries for that care, and there's multiple studies by the government and by non-governmental organizations that demonstrate that it is just not enough, but they keep saying that they're giving this to parents. And so then you end up with this situation where, again, parents kind of come and they're like, oh great, we've got our free childcare, excellent, and we have to explain, actually it's not free, it's just subsidized by us out of our zero profit. So it's just a real juggling act, in short. As I say, there's lots and lots of nurseries are closing down. They're closing down faster than ever, and it's just because it is kind of unsustainable. So at some point something will give. I hope, not because I want anybody to kind of have to go through the pain of not having access to childcare, but just because we need at some point for something to change if this is going to if this industry and this sector is going to be able to flourish and provide the care that we feel children and families deserve. So
I remember. So back, I think it was in October, in the Pregnant and Screwed March, where you're advocating for precisely this. You want people to work, but if people have children and they can't afford them to send them to nursery, then they can't work, which means that they're not contributing. But then also, if the nurseries are closing, you can't take them anywhere. And then in those nurseries that are still available, you have incredible staff that is, motivated, trained, because that's the other thing. It's not anyone that just can walk in and take care of them, but they're earning, like you were saying, even less than someone that is at the checkout in Aldi. Something's got to give, but what is it? Because the more that it goes on this trajectory, the fewer people that are going to be able to work for 4 years of their lives. That's one child, but if they have more than one,
I know. I mean, it's crazy. I think in terms of what the solutions are, I think we need more funding from the government, or we need the government to be honest about the fact that they're not offering 33 hours. They're offering X amount of money, and nurseries can't survive on those rates. It's just impossible. It's like just so far below what we need just to kind of just offer the most basic of care, let alone actually remunerating our staff and paying them above minimum wage and recognizing, giving them a pay rise after however much time in an organization, and giving them the time that they need to study and whatever. So there's that. I think the other thing is that a few of us have been campaigning for is for them to change the rules around what is considered qualified. So I won't bore you with the details, but at the moment, for example, I've had a member of staff who had, I think it was 15 years of experience in early years, and she had a degree in speech and language therapy for children. The value that she could offer to the nursery was just incredible. The difference she could make for all of those reasons, but she was considered unqualified. Whereas someone who has what's called a level 2 in childcare, which I don't know, I think it's a qualification, takes about a year to do, and it's probably, I'm not sure if it's probably it's an MVQ, so it's kind of, it's definitely got its value, The quality of candidates is really variable. Sometimes it can just be someone didn't really know what to do, and they didn't have what it took to do level 3, or or certainly didn't feel they were ready for that. So they did it, and they kind of come along, and there's some that are brilliant, and there's some that just really aren't. But because we've got to meet these ratios of qualified staff, we have to remunerate them accordingly. And so essentially we have to turn away really fantastic staff because they're unqualified. And again, I mean, this might be that they've got a teaching degree. It might be that they've studied, they're a qualified child psychologist. It might be, all these things that have obvious benefits in a setting, and we're having to turn those people away to take level 2s and level 3s, which again, sometimes they're brilliant, sometimes they're not. So I think that's something that we've been campaigning for a while for the government to change, because it's another way that our hands are being tied when it doesn't make sense, and it's not good for the kids, and it's not good for anyone. So that's one thing I think that could be done, that would actually really do a lot to quickly solve some of the problems with recruitment and retention, because as I say, you've got these really passionate people who want to work in early years, but the money's just not enough, because we're having to give the money to the level 2s and 3s.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that. That's another curveball that you can really plan for, and it requires lots of lobbying, which is long, expensive, and that kind of thing. So where does Bonitots go now? Where does the future look like for the nursery?
So the original plan was to expand and open up settings, certainly across London and maybe throughout the country. Given the current climate in the sector, that's the last thing on my mind at the moment. I don't have any intention of expanding beyond what we're doing here, other than, I say that I have toyed at points with opening another satellite setting in the area, just to kind of cope with demand and meet demand from families. And that's something that I would maybe consider, but not whilst recruitment and retention is as it is. It's just, I need to have a really, really quality team, and I wouldn't be able to staff another setting with a quality team at the moment. So it's at the moment it's not possible. So I think it's very much kind of, it's very dependent on how much the government shifts its stance on various things, so that we could deliver more at the quality we expect. And at the moment it's just not possible. So
that must be a bit frustrating, to have the dreams and the vision but be thwarted because execution is just not possible. Feels very frustrating. And what would you do it again? If you were rewind 3 years, 4 years, would you do it again? No?
Not through COVID, definitely. Like, if I had a magic looking glass that could have shown me the future, then absolutely not. If it wasn't for COVID, I guess it's hard to say, because I don't know, had we, as projected, started breaking even in March of 2020, and then been able to grow in a much more I suppose a much more controlled way, because we needed to kind of meet the financial demands of the business. So we probably would have taken on children more slowly if we could have, and just had a slower growth. So I wouldn't do it again the way that it has happened, but I also don't regret it. I mean, it's been beautiful, and my children are bilingual, and the children at the setting are getting this wonderful experience, and we're the only place that can offer them those specific things. Like, the Spanish immersion is really important, but another aspect that's really important to us is about kind of having an attachment approach with the children, and really prioritizing child well-being above, all the other kind of demands that Ofsted makes. Like, we've had to be, again, very clever and duck and dive to manage to prioritize child well-being in spite of what Ofsted is asking of us. Yeah. And we've managed that, and I'm really proud of that. So yeah, I think I definitely don't regret it, and I'm glad that we have achieved what we have achieved, and that we're still here. We're still standing,
Yeah. What would you, just to wrap up, would you say your biggest learnings have been as a business owner, and then separately as someone that hangs around very demanding little people and parents?
I would sum it up by saying that I have had to learn to how to maintain boundaries whilst not losing touch with, my values.
Yeah.
And that's, in my previous job, I did have a team, and I was very much learning to be good at management. And I have really high standards, for myself. So when I say good at management, I think I was good objectively, but I wasn't where I wanted to be. And managing Bonitots through COVID has forced me to get really, really good at, as I say, like, being able to talk to staff and talk to my team when there's problems, honestly and openly, but without being too hard, and as I say, losing touch with, who I am and what's important to me.
Yeah.
And actually that balance, it's like anything, as you learn to get it right, sometimes you go too far in one direction or the other. So I think I went from people pleaser to kind of, right, this is how it needs to be, and that's it. I mean, not quite that, but and I think now I've sort of settled on what I think a book that I was reading called Radical Kindness. It's just sort of being radically honest and radically kind and radically compassionate, and keeping sight of your priorities, and not kind of letting things jeopardize your security, or your team's security, or business's security. Yeah.
Well, it sounds that it's been a painful way to get to that spot, but definitely worth it, and definitely something that it will be of value, not just at the nursery setting, but whatever shape that takes in the future. So, it's always good to hear that that's the approach for someone that is taking care of my child. So thank you for that. Lianne, thank you so much for your time and your generosity and sharing with me. I think this has been probably, not just an illuminating fact in the way a nursery works, but also, I was aware of some of the pains that we've had to overcome together because of, what's been going on in the last few years, but absolutely in a completely different shape, through the business lens of the ownership of how you do it, why you do it, and where you want to go. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.